On Christmas Eve in 2008, another quiet neighborhood in Covina, California was preparing for the final moments of the holiday. Inside a modest home, members of an extended family had gathered to celebrate Christmas together. The atmosphere was warm and festive. Children played, adults talked and laughed, and food was spread across the table. It was the kind of family gathering that happens in countless homes every year, ordinary and comforting, with no sign that anything was wrong. For the people inside, this night was supposed to end with hugs, goodbyes, and plans to meet again soon. Late in the evening, the doorbell rang. When one of the guests went to answer it, they saw a figure standing outside dressed as Santa Claus. The red suit, white beard, and Santa hat immediately brought smiles to the faces of those nearby. No one felt fear. Santa Claus was a symbol of joy, generosity, and childhood innocence. Believing it to be a harmless surprise or a family joke, the door was opened without hesitation. The moment the door opened, the night turned into a nightmare. The man in the Santa suit pulled out a handgun and fired directly at the person who opened the door. The sound of gunfire shattered the peaceful Christmas atmosphere. Screams filled the house as people realized this was not a joke, not a misunderstanding, but a deadly attack. Panic spread instantly. Guests ran in different directions, some trying to hide, others desperately searching for exits. The shooter continued firing as he entered the house. Bullets struck walls, furniture, and people. Some victims collapsed immediately, while others were wounded and tried to escape through windows or back doors. The confusion was overwhelming. Parents screamed for their children. Relatives called out names, unable to see clearly through the chaos. Within seconds, the home that had been filled with laughter became a scene of terror. The attacker was not finished. Hidden beneath the Santa costume was a homemade flamethrower. After shooting several people, he began spraying flammable fuel throughout the house and igniting it. Flames spread rapidly, catching curtains, couches, and Christmas decorations on fire. The blaze grew out of control almost instantly. Thick smoke filled the rooms, making it hard to breathe or see. As the fire spread, the situation became even more desperate. Some guests managed to escape despite being burned or injured. Others were trapped by the flames and smoke. The heat became unbearable. Windows shattered. Parts of the house collapsed. Neighbors, hearing gunshots and seeing the fire, rushed outside in horror, unsure how to help. Emergency calls flooded police and fire departments. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was fully engulfed in flames. The intensity of the fire made it difficult to enter. Firefighters fought the blaze for hours, knowing there were people still inside. When the fire was finally brought under control, the damage was catastrophic. The home was destroyed, reduced to a blackened shell. Inside, the remains of multiple victims were found. 9 people lost their lives that night. Some were killed by gunfire, others by the fire or smoke inhalation. Entire branches of the family were wiped out in a single attack. Survivors were left with severe burns, gunshot wounds, and lifelong trauma. Christmas Eve, a night associated with peace and family, became a date forever marked by blood and loss. The man responsible for the massacre fled the scene before police arrived. As he escaped, the intense heat caused parts of his Santa costume to melt, burning his skin and fusing fabric to his body. Despite his injuries, he managed to get away in a rented car. Hours later, police discovered his body at another location. He had taken his own life, ending any chance of questioning or understanding his actions directly. Investigators quickly identified the attacker as a man who had deep personal ties to the family he attacked. He had been dealing with a painful divorce, financial stress, and emotional isolation. His anger had grown silently, unnoticed by most of those around him. Instead of seeking help or reconciliation, he chose violence and destruction, planning the attack carefully in advance. Evidence showed that the massacre was not impulsive. The weapons had been prepared beforehand. The Santa suit was modified to conceal guns and fuel. The flamethrower was homemade, designed specifically for the attack. The choice of disguise was deliberate, allowing him to approach the house without raising suspicion. The contrast between the Santa costume and the brutal violence shocked the nation and made the crime even more disturbing. News of the massacre spread rapidly across the country. People struggled to understand how something so horrific could happen on Christmas Eve and how a symbol of kindness could be used to commit such evil. The story dominated headlines, not just because of the number of victims, but because of the chilling method and timing of the attack. The community of Covina was left devastated. Vigils were held for the victims. Neighbors placed candles, flowers, and Christmas ornaments near the burned remains of the house. Survivors faced long recoveries, both physical and emotional. Many struggled with guilt, nightmares, and fear, replaying the events of that night again and again in their minds. Families of the victims were left with unanswered questions and unimaginable grief. Children lost parents, siblings lost siblings, and parents lost their children in a matter of minutes. Holidays became painful reminders rather than times of joy. For them, Christmas would never feel the same again. The massacre also raised broader concerns about mental health, domestic conflict, and warning signs that are often missed. Friends and co-workers later described the attacker as quiet and withdrawn, but not openly violent. Like many real-life horror stories, the danger was hidden behind a normal appearance. There were no clear alarms, no obvious signs that such extreme violence was about to occur. What makes this crime especially horrifying is how calculated and symbolic it was. The attacker chose Christmas Eve, a time when families are most vulnerable, gathered together and emotionally open. He chose a Santa Claus disguise, exploiting trust and tradition to get close to his victims. The combination of planning, deception, and brutality turned an already tragic event into something almost unreal. Years later, the Covina Christmas massacre is still remembered as one of the most disturbing holiday crimes in history. It is often cited as a reminder that real horror does not come from fiction, but from human actions driven by rage, despair, and unresolved pain. The story continues to haunt people not because of mystery, but because of its cruel clarity. On that Christmas Eve, there were no ghosts, no supernatural forces, and no monsters from legends. There was only a man, a costume, and a choice that ended multiple lives and shattered countless others. A door was opened in trust, and violence walked in disguised as joy. The flames eventually died, the headlines faded, and time moved forward, but the impact of that night remains. For those who survived and those who lost loved ones, the horror is permanent. Christmas lights, Santa suits, and holiday gatherings can still trigger memories of fear and loss. The Covina massacre stands as a chilling reminder that even the happiest nights can be shattered in seconds, and that sometimes the most terrifying stories are not whispered legends, but real events that happened when families least expected them. On a night meant for celebration and peace, terror arrived wearing red and white, leaving behind ashes, silence, and a community forever changed. On Christmas Eve in 1945, the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, was filled with the familiar sounds of a large family preparing for the holidays. George and Jenny Sodder had 10 children, and that night 5 of them, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, stayed up late, excited for Christmas morning. The parents allowed them to remain awake past their usual bedtime, a decision that would later haunt them for the rest of their lives. Around 10:30 p.m., George checked that the doors were locked, the lights were off, and the fire in the stove was out before going to bed. Everything seemed normal, calm, and safe. Shortly after midnight, Jenny Sodder was jolted awake by the sound of something hitting the roof. She heard a loud bang, followed by a rolling noise, but when she looked around, nothing seemed wrong. Assuming it was nothing more than a stray object or an animal, she went back to sleep. Less than an hour later, she woke again, this time smelling smoke. When she opened her eyes, she saw flames climbing up the walls of the house. The living room was on fire. Jenny immediately screamed for her husband and children. George jumped out of bed and tried to reach the staircase that led to the second floor where the 5 children were sleeping, but flames blocked the way. The fire was spreading unusually fast, far faster than a normal house fire. In desperation, George tried to use a ladder he normally kept against the house to reach the upstairs windows, but the ladder was gone. He then attempted to drive one of his trucks under the window so the children could jump down, but both trucks mysteriously failed to start, something that had never happened before. As the fire grew out of control, George and Jenny managed to save 4 of their children who had been sleeping downstairs. Helpless and panicked, they watched the upper floor collapse as flames roared through the house. The 5 children upstairs were never seen again. Neighbors arrived and attempted to help, but the fire was too intense. The local fire department was not contacted immediately due to phone issues, and by the time firefighters arrived hours later, the house had been reduced to ashes. When daylight came, the Sodders searched through the remains of their home, expecting to find the bodies of their children. To their shock and confusion, no bones, no skulls, no remains of any kind were found. Fire officials told the family that the children had been completely cremated by the flames. However, George and Jenny refused to believe this explanation. George knew fires well, as he had worked with burning materials before, and he believed that even the hottest house fire could not completely destroy human bones. Their doubts deepened when a local crematorium owner confirmed that bodies normally leave bones behind, even at extremely high temperatures. Adding to the mystery, investigators found that household appliances, such as a refrigerator, remained partially intact, yet the children's bodies had supposedly vanished without a trace. The official ruling declared the fire an accident caused by faulty wiring, but the Sodders knew something was wrong. Strange details began to surface. In the weeks before the fire, George had argued with a life insurance salesman who became angry when George refused to buy a policy. The man reportedly warned George that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. Another visitor to the Sodder home had pointed out the fuse box and said it could cause a fire, even though it had recently been inspected and declared safe. On the night of the fire, a neighbor claimed to have seen a man throwing a ball of fire onto the Sodder house roof, which matched the sound Jenny had heard earlier. Another witness reported seeing people removing items from the Sodder home while it was burning. Yet another claimed to have seen the missing children in a car traveling toward another town after the fire. The Sodders also discovered that the ladder George needed had been moved and thrown into a nearby ditch. When they searched the property, they found it hidden away from the house. The phone line had been cut, not damaged by fire as originally claimed. All of these details pointed toward deliberate sabotage rather than an accident. As the months passed, the Sodders refused to bury the case. They erected a large billboard along a nearby highway with photographs of their missing children, offering a reward for information. They spent years following leads across the country, chasing rumors and sightings. People claimed to have seen the children in Florida, Texas, and even New York. Each lead brought hope, only to end in disappointment. One of the most haunting moments came years later when the Sodders received a photograph in the mail. The image showed a young man who strongly resembled their missing son, Louis. On the back of the photo was a cryptic message suggesting the sender knew something about the case. The family hired private investigators, but the trail went cold once again. Another theory suggested that the children were kidnapped by members of the Sicilian mafia. George Sodder was originally from Italy and had openly spoken against Mussolini, which may have angered some people within the Italian immigrant community at the time. The theory claimed that the fire was staged to cover the kidnapping, allowing the children to be taken and raised elsewhere. While there was no hard proof, the idea fit many of the strange facts surrounding the case. Years turned into decades, but George and Jenny never gave up. They continued to wear black clothing as a sign of mourning and protest. Jenny kept a bedroom ready for the missing children, believing they might return one day. George spent thousands of dollars on investigations, following even the smallest clue. Their lives became defined by loss, hope, and unanswered questions. In 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, Jenny died without ever knowing what happened to her children. George passed away shortly after. Their remaining children carried on the search, but evidence had faded, witnesses had died, and the truth seemed further away than ever. The Sodder children were never officially found. The case remains one of America's most disturbing unsolved mysteries, made even darker by the timing of the event. A night meant for family, warmth, and celebration became the moment 5 children vanished without explanation. No bodies, no arrests, no clear answers. What makes the story truly horrifying is not just the fire but the possibility that the children survived and were taken away, growing up unaware of who they truly were, or worse, that someone planned their disappearance with chilling precision, using Christmas Eve as cover for a crime that would never be solved. Even today, the Sodder case continues to haunt investigators and historians. It stands as a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying stories are not about what we know, but about what we never find out. On that cold Christmas night in 1945, 5 children disappeared into mystery, leaving behind ashes, questions, and a family forever broken by the silence of the unknown. On Christmas Day in 1996, the Ramsey family of Boulder, Colorado, appeared to be living a picture-perfect life. John Ramsey was a successful businessman, his wife Patsy was a former beauty queen, and their 2 children, 9-year-old Burke and 6-year-old John Benet, were well known in their community. That Christmas morning had been filled with excitement, gifts, and family plans. The Ramseys attended a holiday gathering earlier in the day and returned home late in the evening, tired but happy. John Benet was put to bed wearing a white top while the house settled into silence. By morning, everything would change forever. Early on December 26th, Patsy Ramsey went downstairs and discovered something terrifying. Lying on the staircase was a handwritten ransom note, several pages long, demanding $118,000 for the safe return of John Benet. The amount was strangely specific, almost exactly matching John Ramsey's recent work bonus. The note warned the parents not to contact police and threatened that their daughter would be killed if they failed to follow instructions. Patsy screamed for her husband, and in a state of panic, they immediately called 911, ignoring the note's warnings. When police arrived, they began treating the situation as a kidnapping. Officers searched the house briefly but did not conduct a full detailed search. Friends, neighbors, and even a pastor were allowed to enter the home, unintentionally contaminating what would later become a critical crime scene. Hours passed as the Ramseys waited for a phone call that never came. The kidnappers never contacted the family again, which already raised troubling questions for investigators. As the morning dragged on, a police officer asked John Ramsey and a family friend to search the house more thoroughly, looking for anything unusual. During this search, John went to the basement, a place that had not been fully examined earlier. In a small, dark storage room, he made a horrifying discovery. John Benet's lifeless body was lying on the floor, covered with a blanket. She had been strangled and suffered a severe head injury. The ransom note, the waiting, the hope, all of it collapsed into a moment of unbearable horror. John Benet was officially pronounced dead at the scene. The house instantly transformed from a kidnapping site into a murder scene, but by then, crucial evidence had already been compromised. John Ramsey carried his daughter's body upstairs, further disturbing potential forensic clues. The tragedy shocked the nation, especially because it occurred on Christmas and involved such a young child in a seemingly safe, wealthy household. An autopsy revealed disturbing details. John Benet had suffered a blow to the head that caused a skull fracture, followed by strangulation using a cord tied to a broken paintbrush handle. The weapon appeared to have been made from items found inside the home. This suggested that the crime was not random and may have been committed by someone familiar with the house. Investigators struggled to determine the sequence of events, whether the head injury or strangulation came first, adding further mystery to the case. Attention quickly turned to the ransom note. It was unusually long, emotional, and theatrical, unlike most ransom notes, which are brief and direct. Handwriting experts analyzed it closely, comparing it to samples from Patsy Ramsey. While some experts believed Patsy could not be ruled out as the writer, others disagreed. No definitive conclusion was ever reached. The note referenced movies and phrases that seemed oddly dramatic for a real kidnapping attempt, making many investigators believe it was staged. Public suspicion soon focused heavily on the Ramsey family themselves. Media coverage was intense and often cruel. Television shows, newspapers, and tabloids speculated endlessly about what happened inside the house that night. The idea that parents could be involved in such a crime shocked and fascinated the public. The Ramseys, already grieving, found themselves under constant scrutiny and judgment. Police interviews with the family raised more questions than answers. The Ramseys hired lawyers early in the investigation, which many people interpreted as suspicious, though their legal team argued it was necessary due to the aggressive media attention. Over time, investigators developed multiple theories. An intruder broke into the house, a family member caused the death accidentally and covered it up, or someone close to the family was involved. None of these theories could be proven beyond doubt. The intruder theory suggested that someone entered the house through a broken basement window and remained inside while the family slept. Supporters of this theory pointed to unidentified DNA found on JonBenet's clothing. However, critics argued that there was little evidence of forced entry and that the ransom note being written inside the house made no sense for a stranger. Another theory suggested that the crime occurred as a result of an accident inside the family, possibly during the night, followed by a cover-up to protect someone in the household. This idea gained popularity among some investigators and members of the public, though no charges were ever filed. Burke Ramsey, JonBenet's brother, was also discussed in public speculation, though police stated he was never considered a suspect. In 1999, a grand jury was convened to review evidence. The jury voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges related to child abuse resulting in death. However, the district attorney at the time chose not to file charges, stating there was insufficient evidence to secure a conviction. This decision remained secret for years and only became public later, adding another layer of controversy to the case. Years passed, but the mystery never faded. New detectives reviewed the case, DNA testing advanced, and theories continued to evolve. In 2008, new DNA analysis led the Boulder District Attorney to publicly clear the Ramsey family of suspicion, stating that the evidence pointed toward an unknown intruder. This announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some believed justice was finally being restored, while others felt the case was being closed without true answers. Patsy Ramsey died of cancer in 2006, never knowing who killed her daughter. John Ramsey continued to speak publicly, insisting on his family's innocence and calling for renewed investigation. JonBenet's face, once known for child beauty pageants, became a symbol of one of the most haunting, unsolved murders in American history. What makes the JonBenet Ramsey case especially horrifying is not just the violence of the crime, but the unanswered questions. A child was murdered in her own home on Christmas night, surrounded by family, gifts, and supposed safety. The person responsible was never held accountable. The holiday that represents innocence and joy became forever associated with suspicion, fear, and loss. Decades later, the case still disturbs people because it reminds us that true horror can exist behind closed doors, even in places that appear perfect. The silence of that Christmas night, the unanswered ransom note, and the little girl found in a basement continue to haunt investigators and the public alike. JonBenet Ramsey's death remains a chilling reminder that some truths are buried deeper than any basement room, waiting, perhaps forever, to be discovered. On Christmas Eve in 2008, a quiet suburban neighborhood in Covina, California was preparing for what should have been a warm and joyful night. Families were gathering, lights were glowing on houses, and inside one home, relatives had come together to celebrate Christmas. Laughter, food, and holiday music filled the house as more than 20 people, including children, talked and enjoyed each other's company. No one inside had any idea that within minutes, this ordinary Christmas celebration would turn into one of the most horrifying crimes in American history. At around 11:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. When the front door was opened, a man dressed completely as Santa Claus stood outside. He wore the traditional red suit, a white beard, and carried what looked like a gift wrapped in holiday paper. The guests smiled, assuming it was a friendly surprise, maybe a relative playing a joke or spreading Christmas cheer. Instead, the man pulled out a handgun hidden beneath the Santa costume and immediately opened fire. The first victim was shot at point-blank range. Panic exploded through the house as people screamed and tried to run. The man in the Santa suit was Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, a 45-year-old engineer whose life had been falling apart. He had recently gone through a bitter divorce, lost access to his children, and was drowning in emotional pain, anger, and resentment. Christmas Eve, instead of being a time of forgiveness or peace, became the night he chose to take revenge. The home he attacked belonged to his former in-laws, where his ex-wife's family had gathered for the holiday. As people inside the house desperately tried to escape, Pardo continued shooting. Some victims collapsed instantly, while others were wounded and attempted to crawl away. The scene was chaotic, filled with gunshots, screams, and confusion. In the middle of this horror, Pardo revealed an even more terrifying weapon. Hidden inside the Santa suit was a homemade flamethrower. He sprayed burning fuel throughout the house, setting furniture, walls, and Christmas decorations on fire. Within moments, flames spread rapidly, trapping people inside. The fire grew so intense that the house became an inferno. Thick black smoke filled every room, making it nearly impossible to see or breathe. Some guests managed to escape by jumping out of windows or running through the flames, suffering severe burns in the process. Others were not so lucky. Children, parents, grandparents, and relatives were trapped as the fire consumed the home. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was fully engulfed in flames, and the temperature was so high that they had difficulty entering. 9 people were killed that night. Several died from gunshot wounds, while others were burned alive or suffocated by smoke. Among the victims were elderly relatives and young family members who had simply come to celebrate Christmas. The brutality of the attack shocked even experienced first responders. Firefighters later described the scene as one of the worst they had ever witnessed, not just because of the number of deaths, but because of the cruelty and planning involved. As Pardo fled the burning house, his Santa suit began to melt. The intense heat from the fire caused parts of the costume to fuse to his skin, leaving him with severe burns. Despite his injuries, he escaped in a rented car and drove to his brother's home in another city. There, only hours after committing the massacre, he took his own life with a gunshot to the head. His body was found the next day by police. Investigators later uncovered how carefully planned the attack had been. Pardo had spent weeks preparing weapons, modifying the Santa suit to hide guns and fuel, and even wrapping the flamethrower hose so it appeared to be part of the costume. He had purchased plane tickets and weapons accessories, suggesting he may have planned to escape afterward, though his injuries likely changed that outcome. His actions were not impulsive, they were calculated and fueled by deep emotional turmoil. The tragedy deeply affected the Covina community and the nation as a whole. Christmas, a holiday associated with joy, family, and kindness, was forever stained by the images of flames, blood, and a Santa Claus costume used as a disguise for murder. For many people, the story became a symbol of how darkness can exist even during the happiest times of the year. Survivors of the attack were left with lifelong trauma. Those who escaped carried physical scars from burns and gunshot wounds, and emotional scars that would never fully heal. The loss of so many family members in a single night left entire generations broken. Holidays that once brought happiness became painful reminders of loss and fear. The case also raised difficult questions about mental health, domestic conflict, and warning signs that go unnoticed. Friends and co-workers later described Pardo as quiet and withdrawn, but not openly violent. Like many real-life horror stories, the danger was hidden beneath a normal appearance, making it all the more terrifying. It showed how someone can appear ordinary on the outside while carrying immense rage and despair within. To this day, the Covina Christmas Massacre is remembered as one of the most horrific crimes ever committed on Christmas Eve. It serves as a chilling reminder that true horror does not always come from ghosts or monsters, but from real people, real pain, and real choices. On a night meant for peace and celebration, evil walked through the door wearing a Santa suit, and lives were destroyed forever.